Sometime during the night of February 1st into February 2nd, 1959, 9 experienced mountaineers left their tent on the eastern slope of a mountain in the northern Ural range. They did not use the door. The tent flap was found secured, zipped and tied from the outside. Instead, the fabric had been slashed open from the interior. Someone, possibly several people, had taken a knife to their own shelter while still inside it. Then they ran. They ran in temperatures estimated between -25 and -30 degrees Celsius. They ran in socks, or barefoot entirely. They ran without jackets. They ran downhill, away from their equipment, their food, their warmth, everything that would have kept them alive. And they did not come back. 25 days would pass before search teams reached that tent. By then, whatever reason had caused 9 trained mountaineers to slash open their own shelter and flee into a Siberian night had already cost all of them their lives. Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov was 23 years old. A student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, he was already an accomplished hiker and skier with several major expeditions to his credit. He was the kind of person other people followed, organized, methodical, respected. He had planned this trip himself. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, was one of 3 women on the expedition. Friends remembered her as one of the most optimistic members of the group, someone who, according to their shared camp diary, could be counted on to lift morale in difficult conditions. Ludmila Dubinina, also 22, was a student of economics. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko were engineers. Rustam Slobodin, an engineer as well, was known for his physical stamina. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles came from a family with deep roots in the Gulag system. His father had been arrested in the 1930s, a detail that was not discussed openly. Semyon Zolotaryov was different from the others. At 37, he was significantly older, a recent acquaintance who had joined the group late. He was a veteran of the Second World War. He had survived things the younger members could not have imagined. None of that experience would save him. The 9 members of the Dyatlov group were, by any standard, exactly the kind of people who should have made it back. The group departed from Sverdlovsk by train on January 25, 1959. Their destination was Otorten Mountain, a peak in the northern Urals, known for harsh conditions but well within the capability of a party at their level. They carried enough food for 3 weeks. They had maps, compasses, a stove, and cameras. They were documenting everything. Their group diary describes good progress and high spirits through the first days of travel. On the 28th, one member, Yuri Yudin, fell ill with joint pain and was forced to turn back. He was the only one who would return alive, a fact that would define the rest of his life. The remaining 9 continued. They published a handwritten camp newspaper. They called it Evening Otorten, a joke name for an expedition that had not yet reached its destination. The February 1st edition was the final one. It was a single folded sheet, written in pencil, in the teasing and irreverent tone you would expect from young people on an adventure they had trained for. The last entry in that final edition read, "From now on, we know that snowmen exist." It was a joke. A reference to the Monsey legends about the mountain they were camping on. They were young and confident and warm inside their tent. By the following morning, all 9 were in the snow. The group had set up camp on the eastern slope of a mountain called Kholat Syakhl. In the Monsey language, the indigenous people of the northern Urals, that name means dead mountain. Whether that carried any weight for Dyatlov is unknown. What is known is that by the late evening of February 1st, conditions on the mountain had become difficult. The wind had picked up. Temperatures were dropping. The group made the decision to camp on the open slope rather than descend to the treeline below, where they would have had shelter. Their tent was positioned in the open on a relatively gentle incline. They built a small stove inside, ate their dinner, and prepared to sleep. Dyatlov had radioed a progress update earlier in the day. He reported the group was behind schedule by 1 day and planned to complete the route and send their final confirmation from Vishay within a week. That radio contact was the last external communication anyone received from the Dyatlov group. What happened after the group settled in for the night is not known. It has never been established with certainty. What is established is what the rescue teams found 3.5 weeks later. When the group failed to telegram confirmation of their arrival back to Sverdlovsk, already overdue by February 12, there was no immediate alarm. Field communications were unreliable. Schedules slipped. But by February 20, families had begun pressing university officials and regional authorities for answers. Search parties were organized. On February 26, a student rescue team located the tent. It was half buried under snow that had accumulated in the weeks since it had been abandoned, but it was still standing. The outer flap, the entrance, was closed. Secured from the outside. Rescue team member Mikhail Sherevin later recorded in his statements that the tent had been cut open from the inside while still fully erected. The slashes in the fabric were deliberate, made by a knife, from within. Belongings were still inside. Food was inside. Boots were inside. Dyatlov's jacket was inside. The stove was inside, cold now, but present. No one had taken the things you take when you plan to leave. Whatever had happened, it had happened so suddenly, or the threat had appeared so overwhelming, that 9 people with enough training and experience to plan and execute a Category 3 winter expedition had chosen to destroy their own shelter and run into a Siberian night rather than do anything else at all. The rescue teams followed the tracks leading away from the tent. In the deep snow, the individual footprints of 9 people were clearly visible for several hundred meters before the snow became too disturbed to read clearly. The trail led to a large cedar tree, approximately a kilometer from the tent, at the edge of the tree line. Under that tree, rescue teams found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko. Both were barefoot. Neither was adequately dressed for the temperature. The upper branches of the cedar had been broken and partially stripped at heights that could only have been reached by climbing. Whatever one of them had been trying to see, or escape, from that tree was never confirmed. Between the cedar and the tent, rescue teams found 3 more bodies over the following days. Igor Dyatlov himself was found face up, gripping a small birch tree with one hand. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found 100 meters higher on the slope, above Dyatlov, in a position that suggested she had turned back toward the tent. She was the highest of the 5, the closest to getting back. Rustam Slobodin was found between them. A crack in his skull, not from a fall, according to the medical report, had not been the cause of death. He had died of hypothermia, the same as the other 4. The question of what had driven all 5 of them out of their tent and cost them their lives remained unanswered. The final 4 members of the group were not found until May, when the spring snowmelt revealed a ravine approximately 75 meters from the cedar tree that had been buried under 4 meters of snow throughout the winter. Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles, Alexander Kolevatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Ludmila Dubinina were found together. They were partially clothed in garments apparently taken from the members already dead. That detail was significant. It suggested these 4 had survived long enough after the others died to strip clothing from their corpses. The injuries on these 4 victims were devastating and deeply unusual. Thibeaux-Brignoles had a fractured skull. Dubinina and Zolotaryov each had multiple broken ribs, not 1 or 2, but multiple ribs on both sides, shattered simultaneously. The force required to produce those fractures was compared by the Soviet medical examiner to the impact of a major automobile accident. And yet the skin was intact. There were no external wounds corresponding to the internal damage. No bruising consistent with the force of a physical blow. As if something had passed through the body from the outside without leaving a mark on the surface. Ludmila Dubinina was also missing her tongue. The medical examiner's report noted this in precise clinical language without offering an explanation. No explanation was ever officially provided. The formal inquest was led by Lev Ivanov, a senior criminal investigator for the Sverdlovsk Regional Prosecutor's Office. He was an experienced investigator. He had worked serious criminal cases for years. He had the tent, the bodies, the medical examiner's reports, the photographs taken by the rescue teams, and the physical evidence gathered from the scene. He reviewed all of it. He interviewed witnesses. He examined the injuries. He read the entries in the group's own diary and the final edition of Evening Autorten. And after reviewing all of it, he produced his official conclusion and filed it in Soviet Case No. 4, Volume 1. The conclusion was 6 words. The cause of death was an unknown compelling force which the hikers were unable to overcome. 6 words. That was the official answer. The case was then classified by Soviet authorities. The files were sealed and placed in regional archives with restricted access. The families were not provided with the content of the investigation documents. They were specifically instructed not to speak publicly about the case or its circumstances. Dyatlov's parents were visited privately by officials who informed them that there were aspects of the case that could not be disclosed. No charges were ever filed. No suspect was ever identified. No mechanism of death was ever formally named. The case was closed with 6 words and a classification stamp. Lev Ivanov was reassigned to other duties. Several details from the investigation record were not included in the official conclusion and have never been satisfactorily addressed. First, the radiation. Testing of the clothing recovered from the last 4 victims found elevated levels of radioactive contamination, specifically on certain garments, at concentrations described as significantly above normal background levels. The official record contains no explanation for how those garments became contaminated. No nuclear material was reported in the area. The contamination was real and documented, then set aside. Second, the injuries. The pattern of catastrophic internal trauma combined with intact external skin, most pronounced in the last 4, is not consistent with a snow impact or a fall into a ravine. Forensic pathologists who have subsequently reviewed the original autopsy documentation have noted that the injury profile closely resembles the kind of damage produced by a blast overpressure event, a shockwave that passes through internal organs without leaving the surface markings that a physical blow would require. Third, the lights. Multiple members of the rescue search parties, and records from at least one meteorological station in the region, documented unexplained orange or luminous spheres moving in the sky above the Ural range during the days surrounding the incident. These observations were logged and then not followed up in the official record. Fourth, the geography. The Soviet military maintained active and classified testing ranges in the northern Urals during this period. The nature of what was being tested in those zones in early February 1959 was never publicly disclosed. In 2019, under sustained pressure from the Dyatlov Foundation, an organization formed by surviving family members and researchers, the Russian Investigative Committee formally reopened the case. Deputy Prosecutor General Alexander Kuryakov was assigned to lead the review. After completing the investigation, Kuryakov announced the findings. The group had been struck by a delayed slab avalanche. The snow displacement had forced them to flee the tent, and the subsequent exposure and physical injuries were consistent with an avalanche event and the terrain of the slope. Researchers and family members raised objections immediately. The original 1959 investigators had specifically examined and ruled out an avalanche. The photographs taken at the time of discovery showed the snow surrounding the tent was largely undisturbed. The campsite slope angle, measured at approximately 15 to 20 degrees, is considered below the threshold typically required for a slab avalanche to release spontaneously. The tent, though partially buried by drifting snow accumulated over 3 weeks, was still standing in a form inconsistent with an avalanche strike. The 2019 investigation produced no new physical samples, no controlled simulations, and no direct rebuttal of the evidence the original investigators had used to rule out an avalanche 60 years earlier. It provided an answer for why the group left the tent. It left intact every question about how 4 of them came to die with injuries that a snow impact cannot produce. Lev Ivanov had given a final interview in 1990, 1 year before his death. He said the case had what he called a supernatural quality he had been unable to rationally account for, even after everything he had seen. After more than 60 years, 3 explanations continue to attract serious attention from researchers, investigators, and the public. The avalanche theory is now the official Russian position. It accounts for the sudden abandonment of the tent and the disorientation of the group in darkness and cold. It does not account for the radiation detected on the clothing, the catastrophic internal injuries without external wounds, the missing tongue, or why the original 1959 investigators specifically ruled it out. The infrasound theory was developed by a team of researchers who noted that certain mountain terrain configurations can channel wind in ways that produce subsonic acoustic frequencies, resonance at a level that, at sufficient intensity, can cause extreme psychological distress, panic, hallucinations, and a compulsion to flee. This would explain the sudden abandonment and the apparent confusion in the group's movement patterns. It does not explain the injuries or the radiation. The military weapons testing theory holds that Soviet military activity in the northern Urals during this period, possibly involving experimental pressure-based or directed energy devices, either directly caused the catastrophic injuries and deaths, or triggered a panic that drove the group into lethal cold exposure. This would explain the injuries consistent with blast overpressure, the radiation on the clothing, the classified suppression of the case, and the private warnings delivered to families. It does not identify a specific test program or confirm any source. Each theory explains part of what happened. None explains all of it. The available evidence does not allow the complete account to be reconstructed. Lev Ivanov, the man who had access to every piece of physical evidence, who had reviewed every photograph, every medical report, every recovered item from that tent, gave his final public interview to a regional newspaper in 1990, 1 year before he died. He said the Dyatlov Pass case was unlike any he had investigated. He said there were things he had seen during the investigation that he had never included in the official record, because he could not find a framework in which to report them that would have been accepted by his superiors. He said the case had what he called a supernatural quality. Those were his words. Not speculation from a researcher. Not a claim from a theorist. Those words came from the lead investigator. 9 people left their tent on the night of February 1, 1959. The tent was cut open from the inside. The bodies were found half a kilometer away, barefoot, in temperatures that kill exposed skin in minutes. 4 of them died with internal injuries that Soviet investigators never formally explained. Radiation was found on the clothing. The file was sealed for 60 years. When it was finally reopened, the new investigators produced no new evidence and named a cause that the original investigators had specifically ruled out. The case file, even in its current declassified form, still contains redacted sections. The families were never given a full account. And the man who was closest to the truth looked back at what he had seen and chose to call it something he could not explain. The 9 hikers are buried in Sverdlovsk. The mountain is still there. The answer has not been given.